Seller concessions. What are they? Why are they important? If you're planning to sell your home, then you probably are going to hear the term seller concession, and you may be wondering how they're going to impact your home sale. Well, in this video, we are going to break down what seller concessions are, why they are used, and how they can work to your advantage in getting your home sold. Stick around to learn how to navigate this important aspect of selling your home. If this is your first time visiting the channel, and if you want to know everything there is about the Houston market and Houston's best real estate, then subscribe below and tap the bell. That way you'll be among the first to know about the Houston market and Houston's best real estate. And by the way, my name is Michael Hughes. I'm a Texas real estate broker and a Texas real estate attorney of more than 20 years. And along with my wife and business partner, Carol Hughes, we help folks just like you buy and sell Houston's best real estate. Well, let's start with the basics. What is a seller concession? A seller concession is a financial incentive or a monetary allowance that is offered by the seller to the buyer to help cover certain costs that are incurred by the buyer in the purchase of the home. Essentially, the seller receives the buyer's sale proceeds at the closing and then turns right around and hands some of those proceeds right back to the buyer. The buyer then can use those funds for a variety of purposes in the real estate transaction. Basically, a seller concession is a way for the seller to sweeten the deal just a bit by offering limited financial assistance to the buyer in order to get the deal closed. Now, you may be saying to yourself, okay, that's all well and good, but why would a seller be willing to give money back to the buyer? What's in it for the seller? Well, as it turns out, there are a few reasons why it might be in the seller's best interest to offer a seller concession. Let's take a look at a couple of them. First reason, to attract more buyers. If a seller is willing to offer a seller concession, that is going to make their home more attractive to buyers. And it can put that home at an advantage over other listings in the same area where the seller is not willing to offer a concession. That small bit of financial incentive sometimes makes all the difference in the buyer's mind. The second reason is to provide some financial assistance to the buyer. Now, sometimes when a buyer is purchasing a home, things can get a little bit tight between the down payment, the closing cost, the loan origination fee, the inspection fee, all of the other fees and expenses that go into a buyer purchasing a home. Sometimes that can really stretch a buyer's finances to the breaking point. And just a little bit of assistance from the seller sometimes can make all the difference between the buyer having enough funds to actually close the deal or not. Number three is to address issues that were identified in the home inspection. In the home inspection, if things are identified as repair items that need to be addressed, then the seller can provide a seller concession to the buyer in the amount of the repair, and that enables the buyer to handle the repairs after closing at their own pace using their own contractors, their own materials, etc. And the last one we'll talk about today, number 4, is to help offset buyer broker agency fees. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the video, but one of the reasons a seller might consider giving a concession is to help the buyer pay the buyer broker agency fee. If that's going to happen, it often is structured as a seller concession from the seller to the buyer. Now, having talked about the reasons why a seller might want to give a seller concession, let's take a quick minute and look at the most common types of seller concessions in a real estate transaction. And at the top of the list are repair concessions. We talked briefly about this just a second ago, but in the home inspection, sometimes there are issues that are identified as repair issues, and these things are going to have to get resolved either before the closing or as part of the contract. And when they come up, typically the parties have two choices. Either the seller can try to accomplish these repairs while the contract is pending and before the closing, or the seller can give a seller concession to the buyer so that after the closing, the buyer has the funds to handle the repair at their own pace, using their own contractors, their own materials, things like that. If the seller tries to accomplish the repairs before the closing, then in many cases, the buyer's not going to have a great deal of input as to what gets replaced, what quality, what materials, who is going to perform the repair, those types of things. And sometimes that can lead to disagreements or arguments between the parties. You'll see buyers saying, well, you elected just to repair this item when I really wanted it to be replaced. Or you'll see buyers saying, the work wasn't done to my satisfaction. Or they'll say, you did not replace the item with the same quality that was in the home before. So all kinds of things can come up when the seller is trying to accomplish the repairs. But on the other hand, if the seller just agrees to give the buyer a seller concession in the amount of the repair, then after the closing, the buyer has the funds from the seller concession and they can accomplish the repair however they see fit, using whatever contractor they want. And if they want to use the same type of material, they can do that. If they want to upgrade, they can do that. But it's all done after the closing, and it's all controlled by the buyer at that point. Another very common type of seller concession are seller concessions that are designed to assist the buyer with their closing costs. Now, if you think about it, when a buyer is purchasing a home, they got to come up with a whole bunch of money to spend at the closing. So in addition to the down payment, we're talking about loan origination fees. We're talking about home insurance and property tax payments that have to be made at the closing. We're talking about all kinds of other fees that have appraisal fees, everything that has to go towards closing the house. We lump all of those together and we call them closing costs. And while a buyer's down payment is easy to calculate, okay, this much money is the down payment. Closing costs are not so easy to calculate because in many cases these charges are incurred as we go along in the escrow period or while the contract is pending. So it's really difficult at the outset to give an exact number of what the closing costs are. And in some cases, as these closing costs accrue through the transaction, they can add up to a number that pushes the buyer's finances just a little too far. And in doing that, they call into question whether the buyer's going to have enough money to actually complete the closing process and pay all of their closing costs. And it's in those circumstances where, with just a little bit of help from the seller, the buyer will have sufficient funds to pay all the closing costs. And in doing that, the seller actually ensures that their transaction, their own home sale, is insured to close or to succeed. Another type of seller concession that is becoming more popular is the interest rate buy-down concession. Sometimes a buyer will want to buy down their mortgage interest rate so that they can lower their monthly payments. In order to buy down the rate, the buyer will have to pay their lender a lump sum of money at the closing. And in exchange for that payment, the lender agrees to reduce the mortgage rate that is applicable to that mortgage loan. And that in turn lowers the buyer's monthly payments throughout the life of the loan. Well, sometimes the buyers will ask the seller for a little bit of assistance in the form of a seller contribution so that they can buy down their mortgage interest rate. And a fourth type of seller concession that has become very common in recent months is the seller concession to pay the buyer broker agency fee. Now, when it comes to paying the buyer broker fee, there are really two ways that a seller can accomplish this. One is the way that things really have been done for years and years and years and years, and that is the seller will agree to pay a listing fee that includes both the listing broker's fee and the buyer broker's fee. And then at the closing, that combined fee gets paid from the seller to the listing broker. And then the listing broker pays the part that's attributable to the buyer brokerage to them directly. So the money flows through the listing broker. A second way to do this now that has become much more popular is through the use of a seller concession. And using that method, here's what happens. The seller agrees to pay a listing fee that encompasses only the fee of the listing broker. And then the buyer asks as part of the purchase contract, hey seller, will you give me a seller contribution that will cover the fee for my buyer broker? And if the seller agrees to this, then it is set up as a seller concession in the contract so that the monetary payment to the buyer broker comes directly from the seller and it doesn't flow through the listing broker anymore. Either way of doing this accomplishes the same goal. It's just however the listing brokerage has their listing agreement set up, but in certain cases, the fee for the buyer broker is set up as a seller contribution. And this is becoming more and more and more common in real estate transactions. Now, when we are talking about seller concessions, one thing to bear in mind if you're the seller is that seller concessions will reduce the amount that you receive on the sale of your home. After all, a seller concession is you as the seller receiving the sale proceeds and then turning right around and giving some of it back to the buyer. That is going to reduce your overall final net proceeds from the transaction. But even in the face of that, many times sellers find that it is in their own best interest to give a seller concession. And it's for the reasons that we talked about already in this video. Maybe it's to attract more buyers. Maybe it's to address a repair issue. Maybe it is to help pay the buyer broker fee as part of the transaction. Let's take a look at how this might work out using an example. Let's say that the home is under contract at $400,000 and the buyer has asked the seller for a $10,000 seller concession to help pay their closing costs. Okay, so what the seller is actually going to receive is $400,000 minus that $10,000 or $390,000, and that is before we calculate any of the seller's closing costs. So you can see where the reduction comes. It comes right off the top as seller concession is deducted from the total sale proceeds first thing, because that money is handed right back over to the buyer. But in the case where, let's say, that the buyer would not be able to complete the transaction without that $10,000 financial assistance from the seller, then the seller has to make a choice. Is it better to reduce the amount that I'm going to receive on this sale by the amount of the concession? Or is it better for me to have this deal collapse and to have to start over, put the home back on the market, and begin again from square one? The answer to that question is going to depend on the seller's individual circumstances, so no one-size-fits-all answer. But at least in many cases, some sellers will come to the conclusion that the reduction in their proceeds is an acceptable price to make sure that the deal doesn't fall through. So if you're watching this, and if you're thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, what's to stop a buyer from concessioning me right into the poorhouse? Fear not. There are limits to seller concessions, and the limits are based on the specific loan program that the buyer is using. So each individual loan program, whether it's conventional, FHA, VA, USDA, or any of the others, will have its own specific limitation on how much a seller can give a buyer in seller concessions. And typically those limits fall within a range 3% to 6% of the sale price. Now, explaining all of the different limitations for each one of the loan programs would be a whole different video all by itself. So let me just say that your real estate professional will know the limitations for each one of the loan programs when it comes to seller concession. So check with your real estate agent if you want more detailed information about this. Well, by now, I'm sure that it's obvious that the knowledge and experience of your real estate agent is going to be critical when evaluating whether to offer concessions or how to respond to concession requests in the sale of your home. Your agent can help you evaluate the current market, understand the pros and cons of offering or agreeing to concessions, and can help you create a strategy that works best for you. By helping you understand and balance the possibility of concessions versus your pricing strategy for the home, your agent can help ensure that you still receive the maximum possible return. So where does all of this leave us? Seller concessions can be a strategic way to attract more buyers and to close the deal. But they must be weighed carefully against the expenditure to make sure that they're worth the investment. Whether the concession is meant to address repairs, to help with closing costs, or even to help cover buyer broker fees, the right approach will depend on your unique situation and the specific real estate transaction. If you were thinking about selling your home, or if you would just like more information or to explore your options, I would love to help create a strategy to maximize your home's value. Shoot me a quick message and we'll go from there. Now, whether you are looking to make your next move next week, next month, even next year, Carol and I would love to help make your next home sale experience smooth and worry-free. So click on the link below to set up a free one-on-one Zoom meeting. Or, of course, you can always give us a call, shoot us a text, or send us an email. We would love to hear from you, and we are looking forward to helping you buy or sell Houston's best real estate.